Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for attending tonight. I'm Jim Ziegler, the Executive Director of the Great Stone Society's National Iron and Steel Heritage Museum, and we welcome you. Tonight, one of our founding members, resident lecturer, Gene DiOrio, is here to take us on a trip through the UK through his lens and his experiences. So without further ado, let's welcome Eugene.
Good evening, and thank you all for coming. As advertised, this is going to be country touring in Britain. I think a number of you were here in the fall when I did the first half of this, which was in Scotland. I covered the crossing from Canada to Scotland and went through that. Now this evening we're going to pick it up where we left off at the border and go on to England. So without further ado, we'll get started. Okay. Ready? Have to do what? Oh, the light up there, I'm sorry. As I did in the previous lecture, I indicated to you that a feature of this trip was staying in private homes with families, and during the course of this, you'll meet the families I stayed with in England. My last host was in the border country of Scotland, and he drove me down into England. Very open country, and I think I showed this picture. I'm standing on the exact border, 1 foot in England and 1 foot in Scotland. And yes, I did buy a tam while I was there. But here we are, ready to tour England. These pictures, by the way, all date from 1968. And yes, I was a little slimmer. And nobody say you look younger, because of course I was. Well, when you move into this part of England, this is Northumberland. And this is pretty wild open farm and grazing country. And it was very beautiful. Now, my last host, Colonel Stewart, was driving me. And of course, the British loved to picnic. And his wife, Lady Daphne Stewart, had prepared a rather lovely picnic lunch for us, and we found a nice place where we looked over the countryside and enjoyed the outdoors. Northumberland is the northern county of England that faces Scotland. And a major thing that I wanted to see in this area was the Roman Wall, which dates from about, I think, 125 AD. Hadrian, the Emperor Hadrian, decided we don't need Scotland and all that wild country, so we built a wall, which extended across this part of Britain for something like 75 miles. And much of it has been preserved, these great blocks, which you see here. And we went to an area called Housteads, which I was told in advance was one of the best places to see the remains, the ruins of the Roman wall. And yes, it was quite impressive. This is an artist's sketch of what this would have looked like in the days of the Roman. And the area at Housteads was called Boco Vicium. Hadrian is one of my favorite figures from ancient history. He does not fit the Hollywood image of Roman emperors lolling on silk sofas being fed grapes by lovely ladies. He was a soldier, and he went over much of the empire, which was no small deal in his time. And he realized that we couldn't have everything. There was a limit as to how far you can go, even if you are a superpower, which of course Rome was. And so this wall was built to keep them from the hordes of barbarians in Scotland at the time. These very massive stones which were put together for it. I was fascinated with it. This is my host, Colonel Stewart, who, as I say, was the last of the families I stayed with in Scotland. And being a military man, he was very helpful in describing all of this. And of course, I had to have my photograph there. Being of Italian descent, I thought it was particularly appropriate that the first thing I toured in Britain was a souvenir of Rome. feeling very gratified. But I loved it. I could have spent much time here. Of course, it extends for miles, but I was told. All right, Colonel Stewart then had arranged a rendezvous with the first of the families that I was to stay with in England. And with that family, whom you'll meet shortly, we went to Durham. Below Northumberland is County Durham, with its great famous university and the cathedral. The cathedral, aside from being an architectural marvel, has a very dramatic setting overlooking this river. And yes, it's often dark there. We didn't have rain, but it wasn't the brightest day. Durham is considered one of the finest surviving examples of Norman architecture. Remember, the Normans conquered Britain. This vast fortress-like building. In fact, this thing is called the Bishop's Throne. One of the bishops decided to have a memorial, and on the lower level is his sepulcher, you might say, and above it a throne, a bishop's throne, considered one of the biggest and most dramatic in all of the churches in Britain. The carved choir stalls, which are really quite a work of art. The tomb of St. Cuthbert. Now, Cuthbert was an early saint, Benedictine monk, very prominent in the history of that period. We're talking about the 8th and 9th centuries. And when they found his body after years of entombment, it had not decayed, so it was moved several times. But this is the tomb of St. Cuthbert in the Durham Cathedral. This clock, medieval clock. Now, Sir Walter Scott wrote about this, and he called it half Cathedral of God and half fortress against the Scots. And the story goes that during the Cromwellian Revolution, Cromwell imprisoned hundreds of Scots prisoners in this cathedral. The monk's refectory with its wonderful old beams. But being imprisoned there with very little to live on, they chopped up much of the early woodwork to keep warm. So some of the original fittings are gone. Durham was, I've seen several cathedrals during the course of this tour in Britain, but this one was memorable because of the drama. Now that's called a sanctuary knocker. And in medieval life, if you were escaping the law and you managed to get there and firmly clasp that ring, you were safe. You had the sanctuary inside the church. I don't think we have anything comparable today, but these exist in various places in Britain. Again, the drama of this church on this hill above the river. All right, well, my first family in England lived in Yorkshire. And from County Durham, we came down to Yorkshire. They lived in this little town which is called Thirsk, T-H-I-R-S-K. Sort of the market town for that part of York County. And if you've been watching Dereham Abbey, and who hasn't been, they talk about going to Thirsk. Well, this house was called the Hall, and it was the home of the family that I stayed with in Yorkshire. Charming old building from the 18th century, and adjoining it was this wonderful old Gothic church. Beautiful church, and it was right next to their house. And this was the back of the house overlooking a garden. You can see what it rains often in Britain, but there is a benefit. The grass is green, the gardens are good in Britain. This was all part of their grounds and their house. The Bells, that was the family name. And having the church as a background added to the beauty of their gardens, certainly. I loved this church, and I walked around it many times during the days that I stayed here. Some Gothic details. And a view of the house from one of the entrances to the old church. You see the old tombstones. Well, this is my first British hostess, Mr. and Mrs. Bell. He had retired from the Army. He was a colonel in the Army. Hilary Bell, Peter and Hilary Bell. Absolutely delightful people. I must say, all the families I stayed with were wonderful. There was none that I couldn't have stayed with much longer. And I toured with them. Hilary had quite a good bit of wit and charm, and she was very knowledgeable about the area. And they talked to me about the war years, when there was real fear of German invasion. And she said, yes, my husband told me if the Germans come, just keep your mouth shut and don't stick them with hat pins. You won't get anywhere with it. They were lovely. And here I am at the house. You can tell how old these pictures are. I'm dressed in suits most of the time. This predates traveling in jeans and sweatshirts. They had these two beautiful golden labs, which took a liking to me. They followed me all over the house, and I liked them. So Mrs. Bell and I are about to set off some touring. As I explained to the group before, this arrangement of staying with families was more than just a bed and breakfast thing. They actually toured with me in the area where I was, and it was marvelous. I didn't have to find anything. Well, of course, the major thing was to see the city of York, this ancient medieval city of York, dominated by the famous York Cathedral. York has a lot of its old remnants and a number of medieval gates, which happily have been preserved. And a lot of this wall has survived, and you can walk around much of the perimeter of the old city on this wall, which you see here. It was absolutely fascinating. And there's a river, I think it's called the Oise, something like that, which flows through the middle of York. This is a remnant of an old medieval monastery, this Gothic arches. The greenery in Britain always fascinates me, the parks and how beautiful the lawns are. An old church. And the town itself is full of cramped little buildings and houses and so forth. And this caught my eye, this golden fleece. I gave a print of this to someone I knew for many years who used to work for Brooks Brothers in Philadelphia. And of course, they use this on their stationery. And she said, oh God, Gene, that's our company logo. I said, well, I didn't think Brooks Brothers had a store in the middle of York, but yes, that's what they use as a logo, the Golden Fleece. The York Cathedral, or as it's called, York Minster, is breathtaking. It's one of the largest cathedrals in Britain, and is famous for marvelous stained glass, much of which escaped the period of the Cromwellian Wars when a lot of stained glass was destroyed. It's also sort of dedicated to the Royal Air Force. And the day we toured it, the Air Force band was going on. These towers are simply magnificent. And when you walk into it, it's just breathtaking, the size of this. These medieval cathedrals with these great arches. I mean, you remember that this was done before large cranes or any of the construction things we had before. It took years, of course, to build these things, but they are the great symbols of medieval Europe, these cathedrals. And this certainly, I think, is one of the most impressive ones. A couple of years after I was here, they had an enormous fire in one of the wings of it. Fortunately, they got it out before it spread to the main roof. And replacing the section was tremendous. Queen Elizabeth left them cut some timbers from Windsor Park to be able to do it. Yes, great deal of stained glass, and it's considered some of the best surviving medieval glass in Britain. This was a monument to the British Royal Air Force in the church. And there it is again. It's just breathtaking. I think that's the end of reel one. Yes. Now, of course, this tour is going to include some very historic houses, and this is one of the greatest and grandest, called Castle Howard. It's in Yorkshire. It's the Howard family, who are the Earls of Carlisle. And this house is considered one of the, I'd say, half a dozen most famous great houses in Britain. Castle Howard. And there it is. Sort of like moving in and living in the state capital, but it's really quite impressive. Tuesday of this week, I went to a lecture in Philadelphia on Castle Howard. There is an organization called the Royal Oak Society that does lectures, publications, tours to promote British history. And this particular Tuesday, the one in Philadelphia, was on Castle Howard. And the lecture was being given by Simon Howard, who is a member of the family who owned this place. It's still family owned and controlled. Very interesting history, architectural history. Somewhere in the 1600s, the Earl of Carlisle decided he needed a grander house, and he employed an architect by the name of Sir John Vanbrugh. Vanbrugh is a rather interesting character. He wasn't really an architect originally. He has something of a military background. Then he dabbled in playwriting, which were successful. And he was friendly with the Earl of Carlisle, and they talked about architecture, and apparently the Earl said, all right, what are your ideas? So he came up with this. It's the first great house in Britain that had a dome, and one of the first domes built in Britain. We're talking about 1702, 1703, the early period when this was built. This is the interior of the Grand Hall. There are fireplaces on either side, staircases built behind those fountains. Now, if you saw the popular television show some years ago, Brideshead Revisited, it was filmed here. And as Mr. Simon told us at the luncheon the other night, that was a godsend, having the movie company coming in and filming it. Not only for what it was they paid, but it brought the place to a great deal of popularity. And thousands of people came to see the house after the television show. Just as people are going to look at Highclere Castle in England since the Downton Abbey show. As Mr. Howard explained to us at the dinner the other night, it was an enormous project to take on. One of the early Howard family girls. The house was run down, the grounds were a mess, rotting woodwork, roofs, all the things that go with historic houses. And to make it even better, they had a massive fire there in 1940. This is the mausoleum of the Howard family that's on the grounds, in which they're also restoring. Still using it, I was told, for family burials. At the time of the Second World War, the British were very concerned about children. They wanted to get them out of London to escape the Nazi Blitz. And a girls' school was put into Castle Howard, and it wasn't bombed, but a fire started, and much of the house was devastated, including the dome. But the Howards worked together and raised money and restored the dome. The dome was done when I was there. One whole wing was pretty much gutted and hadn't been finished yet when I was there. As it happened, the Bell family that I stayed with in Thirsk were friends with the Howard family. So we went over there one Sunday and just made ourselves at home. And I had the pleasure of meeting Lady Cecilia Howard, who was busy showing tourists through on a Sunday afternoon. And she was most gracious, and I was delighted to find when I talked to Mr. Howard on Tuesday night in Philadelphia that was his mother. And there it is, Castle Howard. Sometime later, a movie was made on the same story, Brideshead Revisited, and it was also filmed here at Castle Howard. The Howards have formed a corporation. This is a real study in historic house preservation, sort of like a 501c that we have. The family still owns it. They control it through a couple of corporations. One owns the contents, the artwork, and another group sort of does the management. But bit by bit, they've raised money, they've restored the house, cleaned up the grounds, and they have everything here: weddings, horse shows, motor shows, some of the things we're thinking about here. I wish somebody would do a movie at Greystone. It would really help us raise money. But it was a cloudy, windy, overcast day that we were there, but it was just fascinating. And one thing that Mr. Howard showed us the other night was they had to deal with heat. So they scrapped the old heating plant and, would you believe, put in thermal heating. Very much the thing we're talking about at Greystone. They drained that lake that's in front of it and put all the wells there, and then refilled it so that you can't see them. And he says it's working beautifully. Well, then we moved across England into Chester, and of course, coming from Chester County, I wanted to see Cheshire. The slides you're going to see are all purchase slides because it rained the whole time I was in Chester. But Chester is one of the most interesting cities, and like York, it has a wall, and you can circle around much of the city on this medieval wall, which they have painstakingly restored. Another favorite thing of Chester are these shops with the double level of shops, and they have these porches over them so that you can go from store to store without getting wet. A lot of medieval houses and buildings in Chester. The car really clashes with that building, doesn't it? And there is a cathedral, a smaller one, the Chester Cathedral, but it is rather impressive. And the interior. What passes for a small cathedral in Britain would be a very large church here in America, I think. Some lovely stained glass, of course. A side chapel. No matter how many of these I went through, I was always impressed with the stonework, the vaulting work, how it was done in that period. The Chester River, which flows through the city. Now a railroad bridge. There was a British engineer whose name was Telford, who built several and designed several of these bridges. That reminds us, of course, of what we have here in Coatesville, but this was done in England long before with these bridges. Railroading really started in Britain. In fact, I think in Yorkshire they claim the first railroad. The Stockton and Darlington was put together. Well, I took a side trip into Wales to see Chirk Castle. This, I understand, is the oldest inhabited castle in Wales. Quite a fortress. That's the way you entered in through the car. We went through the gate into a courtyard. Looks like a prison almost, but it is magnificent. And there's the courtyard. But the interior had been done in graceful 18th century Adams style. My going here is attributed to my love of champagne. And there's a story here. In 1963, I made my first trip to Europe, spent most of it in France, and as part of the trip, got to visit the Moet and Chandon champagne people in Épernay. And when I was there, they were entertaining a group of people from England called the Goldsmiths Company. And one of the people there was a gentleman named Colonel Middleton. And over a very pleasant dinner there, he told me about his home, Chirk Castle, and how he was trying to hold it together and hoped I'd visit someday. Well, 6 years later, no, 63 to 68, 5 years later, I took him up on his invitation. And he said, by all means, come. So I went to Chirk, and we had a lovely dinner there in this dining room. And it was really quite a very special experience. He was most gracious. As you can see, the interior was redone in later style. And there we are. This ornate gate was on the grounds. I was fascinated with that gate. Well, from there, I was in this area called Wolverhampton, and we looked at small villages. You know, there's a great deal of charm in these villages in Britain, not just the grand castles and so forth. And it was here that I had my next hosts. A lady in the blue dress in the foreground, Mrs. Lloyd. I think it was her brother that was visiting, and her close friend, Mrs. Fullerton, and their daughter and her husband. When they learned I worked for a steel company, they said, oh, you got to take a day to go to Birmingham, which wasn't too far away. Turned out her husband owned one of the largest steel casting firms in Britain, but everything was so closely arranged for me that I just didn't get there. But it was wonderful. And here I am between my two hostesses. They shared me. One toured me one place, another one another place. In fact, I stayed at Mrs. Fullerton's home. She was lovely. In the background, you see a lot of china. Mrs. Lloyd had an outstanding collection of the china from that area, which is called Coalport china. My two hostesses. And we drove around the area to see some of these villages, the countryside. We went to Ludlow, and fortunately had good weather for that. Ludlow likes to tell the world it's one of the prettiest villages or towns, small cities in England. And I wouldn't argue with it. I thought it was absolutely delightful. I love Ludlow with its ancient buildings, its shops. My favorite picture are, here you see 4 types of architecture. You see the medieval on the right, and the Gothic cathedral in the back, an 18th century red brick sort of Regency, and on the left, classic. 4 pieces of architecture all blending very beautifully there. And dominated by this lovely church. And I love to take pictures with light showing through on the Gothic woodwork. Church of St. Lawrence here in Ludlow. And a number of prominent people in the burial area outside the church, but the one that really caught my attention was this one. Alfred Housman, A.E. Housman, famous poet, professor of Latin, remembered for having been the author of a book called The Shropshire Lad. Very great popular book. Housman was known for very, very carefully chiseled poetry. It was beautiful. I remember from the Shropshire Lad, he said, oh, I've been to Ludlow Fair. I've left my necktie, oh God knows where. And I've carried home, or halfway near, pints and quarts of Ludlow beer. Oh, I, man, see the world through the pewter pot and see the world as the world is not. The mischief is, it doesn't last. But many a peer of England brews poetry livelier than the muse. And malt does more than Milton can to reconcile God's ways to man. I love Housman. This was a famous old pub called the Feathers. And of course we had a great grand lunch here at the Feathers in Ludlow. And of course you have to see the ruins of Ludlow Castle, which was once a great fortress. I think Henry VIII used it and others. During the Cromwellian period, it was battered down, but the wall's still there, and it is still quite impressive. And of course, I love meandering through arches and getting pictures through arches, as this one is. A lot of plays were produced here in that period, and I think it was King Edward IV's sons who were the little princes of the Tower who were murdered during the period. But this is Ludlow Castle. Well, Mrs. Lloyd was a wonderful tour guide, and we saw this great open area that's called Wenlock Edge. And that was really breathtaking. And there were places in Britain where I felt very much at home because the countryside could be Chester County. Well, we went to see this old manor house called Stokesay. Dates from the Middle Ages. It's more of a, they call it Stokesay Castle, but it's really more of a fortified manor house. Now, up in Reading, Pennsylvania, in Berks County, there's a long restaurant, I guess it's still operating, called Stokesay Manor. And I had been there many times, and of course, I've got to see Stokesay. So this is the one in England. I think the one in Reading was, I won't say copied, but inspired by this one. This cute little house and this ancient graveyard, well grown up. But this is Stokesay. Stokesay Castle. Just a fascinating place. And a pond with a swan. Now, a British joke on swans. In London, there's a well-known department store called Swan and Edgar. Swan and Edgar. Swan and Edgar. So if they see a swan, they say, all right, where's Edgar? So we saw a swan. Oh, sorry. The end of a reel. Oh, thank you. Nope. Okay. Now a bit of industrial history. Learning from my conversations, I was interested in industrial history. Mrs. Lloyd took me to this place called Coalbrookdale. There's an old ancient railroad bridge there, but the interesting thing is Coalbrookdale has a very definite place in history, of industrial history. The foundry is quite old, but there was a gentleman named Abraham Darby who was credited with having first successfully did iron with coke, smelting with coke. Several of us went down to Hagley a few weeks ago to hear a lecture by a lady who's done a book called Managing Iron, and her book refers to this. So Abraham Darby is quite a major figure in the history of this. Britain, of course, was the cradle of the Industrial Revolution. There are furnaces, some of which date from the late 1600s and then the later 1700s, which have been carefully preserved. And it was just fascinating to see these. The plant later made all sorts of things, castings and so forth, including some of the material for pumps for Thomas Newcomen's steam engines. This is a very important thing in the history of our Industrial Revolution, Coalbrookdale. That was one of the later furnaces. They adopted the earlier furnaces to smelting with coke after Darby developed this. And that's not Mr. Darby, it's me on an off day with wrinkled trousers, but I was fascinated with this place. They made all sorts of things. The large pot was one of their manufactories, and they've come to be referred to as missionary pots. You could cook 2 or 3 of them in one of that size. They made some of the earliest railroad locomotives ever, and here you see a few of them which they had on exhibition there. Well, then a little way away was this town where they made iron for this bridge, and it's called Iron Bridge. As was told to me, it's considered the first bridge made of iron, and it was produced there in Coalbrookdale. Fortunately, they don't allow cars on it, but I walked back and forth over it. It was fascinating to see this. This is a major landmark in industrial history, using iron for this sort of purpose. And there it is, the Iron Bridge. Well, during the course of this, I stayed with 5 families in Britain, but also stayed with a couple of other families who were not part of the tour, as arranged by the British travel thing for me, but we're really friends. This is Kenilworth Castle, and you're in Warwickshire, pretty much in the middle of England. Now, Kenilworth was one of the great castles of the medieval and later period, and Queen Elizabeth I visited here. The Earl of Leicester was one of her great friends, and she came here frequently. During the Cromwellian Wars, it was pretty much destroyed, but it's still, the remains of themselves are greatly impressive. I met friends, a very good friend in this area with whom I visited, and you'll see in a moment, but it was he who took me on this tour. Part of the buildings of the castle. And the countryside, rolling countryside around Kenilworth. Those of us who struggled through Sir Walter Scott in high school, one of his most famous books was, of course, Kenilworth. And a connection here with our Rebecca Lukens. She adored Sir Walter Scott's work, his poetry. She tells in her memoirs of she and Dr. Lukens reading his poetry. And we understand that her father's mill down the creek here at Rokeby got its name from his poem, Rokeby. Well, the friends that I stayed with lived in this nice modern development called Thickthorn Close. Lots of roses. Had to take a minute to say that. Thickthorn Close. Charles Davy. Now, Mr. Davy was someone I met in 1966 when I made my second trip over on the Queen Mary. We were fellow passengers and fellow table mates. Delightful gentleman, born in Northern Ireland, but very Catholic. And as a young man, he had gone to sea with the Cunard Steamship Company. And as I learned during the course of the crossing, he was doing very well with it. But while he was on an extended cruise with one of the Cunard ships, his young daughter died. So he was quite a while getting back to Britain, and he decided, that's it, I'm not going to sea anymore. And he told me that Cunard was just great. They said, look, Charlie, we love you. You're doing very well. We want you to stay. Take as much time as you want, but come back. But he said, no, I'm never going to sea again. So he started a business, restaurants, and eventually owned a string of small hotels. Well, now here it is, 1968. His wife had died. He decided to go to the United States to visit a sister. And he came back on the Queen Mary. First time he had been at sea, and he was an absolute delight. Full of wonderful stories. This was in his neighborhood. So we toured a bit with him, and he was just a superb person. Well, while I was with him, we went to Coventry. Now there you see on the left the old St. Michael's Cathedral, and on the right the modern structure, the modern St. Michael's Cathedral. As the war progressed, the Germans kept bombing smaller cities as well as London. And one of the cities they hit was Coventry, and they devastated it. Much of Coventry was lost, including Coventry Cathedral. Happily, the spire, the tower survived. The rest of it was just a gutted ruin. So when the war was over, the British decided not to attempt a restoration, to make it as a war memorial, and to build a whole new cathedral. The altar was built from stones that had fallen. The wooden cross above it was built from part of the roof timbers, and the metal cross was some of the iron from the roof timbers. And I don't think you can see it too clearly, but in the back of that, they carved in the wall, "Father, forgive." This was one of the most impressive war memorials I saw anywhere, and it was very touching. We spent a good bit of time. There it is, "Father, forgive." Happily, the tower and the spire did survive the war. Well, here's the new cathedral. They decided to build something totally new. And the sculptor, Sir Jacob Epstein, did this very interesting modern sculpture of St. Michael triumphing over the devil. The interior of the church is strikingly modern. You see the way the organ pipes are arranged. And there's the nave with a high altar. Very modern, of course. This was dedicated, I think, about 1962 with Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth there. That's an enormous tapestry to the background of it. And a screen with these etched angels and other figures. Baptismal font. It was a huge stone brought from the Bethlehem area in the Holy Land, and it's called the Bethlehem Baptismal font. And a chapel. Now, the most famous person in Coventry's history, of course, is Lady Godiva, who agreed that she would ride naked through the city in return for taxes being cut off. And she did, but of course somebody had a watch, and he became known in history as Peeping Tom. But she's most famous, and as you can see, there's a lot of modern buildings because Coventry was pretty well wiped out by the German bombing. Lady Godiva. She's also inspired a very popular brand of chocolates, I understand. We also went to Royal Leamington Spa, which is sort of a resort with, I'm told, healthful waters, lovely parks, and I'm told that this is just about the geographical center of England. Lovely spot. We had a beautiful luncheon there one day. The ponds and the fountains. Royal Leamington Spa. And there it is. The small village of Warwick was also charming to see, with this ancient church. And of course, Warwick Castle. Again, one of Britain's most famous castles. The Earls of Warwick, looking over the River Avon. Extremely picturesque sight. I understand the Brooke family, who were the Earls of Warwick, have given this place up in recent years. I think they got tired of keeping it. I hope it's wrong, but I've heard that it's become much more touristy than it was. But a fascinating place with these great towers. And again, my love of looking through arches and taking pictures through them. One of the center blocks of it. Well, the interior of the castle is fantastic with these great halls. Again, these are purchase slides. They're not as clear as I would like them. A fantastic collection of armor, as you see there. And a lot of very formal rooms. The painting on the far end is one of the kings. And as I've watched those dining room sequences in Downton Abbey, I think there's a copy of that picture used in that show. I think this was called the Red Cedar Room, in that all the woodwork was cedar. The furniture, as you can see, is enormously elaborate. And the chapel. These places usually had their own chapels. And a smaller sitting room. And still another one. And the grounds, of course, were quite impressive. Topiary trees carved carefully. Lots of roses in England. Peacock on the ground, looking rather annoyed to have to share his garden with tourists. Another great tower. This was a wonderful afternoon that we spent here at Warwick Castle. Oop. Sorry, got to change it again. I run through these pretty fast. Number 4. Pardon?
I think there's a Colebrook deal. Don't we have a Colebrook there also in eastern Pennsylvania somewhere? Yeah, somewhere.
Yeah, there is.
Berks County.
Well, as you travel about England, it comes home to you that we were a British colony because there's so many familiar names.
All the names came with us.
All right, well, after I left that, I moved further south, and I'm now to my 3rd British host. And The family here had the oldest house that I stayed in. It dated to the 1600s. And they had carefully restored it. I think it was called Abnoth, Colonel and Mrs. Lambert, and this was their home. Quite a medieval pile. And there they are, comfortably sitting by their fireplace. And I don't know what the china was, but I was told it was a good collection. Abnorth, I think, was this area. So there we are. And their garden. And I love this. They had this great blue Bentley. So we toured around the countryside with the Bentley. You felt like you should wave to people while you were sitting there.
You were styling it.
Oh, yes. So we spent a lot of time driving. Well, of course, we were in the Shakespeare country, and I toured the Shakespeare country with them. This is Stratford-on-Avon, or Avon, and that building in the foreground was a grammar school where I believe Shakespeare went to school as a boy. This is the house in which he was born, Shakespeare's birthplace, and one of the rooms in the house, and one of the bedrooms. They don't claim he was born in that bed. It is furnished to the period. And a garden behind the house. Well, this is Shakespeare's land, and there is this monument called the Gower Memorial to Shakespeare, whom you see sitting on top of it. And around it are statues that refer to his plays. This one is Hamlet, of course. Alas, poor Yorick, I knew him well. And I think this is Macbeth, I'm not sure. But I love that picture silhouetted against a dramatic sky. The Gower Memorial. The river there, this is a more modern bridge. There's an older one that dates, I think, to Shakespeare's time. It's amazing how things last over there. Lots of swans in the river, people rowing. I think the swans have a very good public relations outfit. People think they're beautiful and gracious, which they are, but they have a reputation for being a rather nasty bird. You get too close, they'll snap at you. So don't get too close. But they are beautiful, and there are loads of them on the river. Well, there is a theater there, of course, which is devoted to Shakespeare's plays. There was a Victorian theater which burned, but they've saved some of the walls of it. You can see the remnants. But a lovely thing to do was to walk along the river to go up to the church. I mean, it's such a picture of rural England. Another one of my favorite pictures taken through a clump of trees. And this is the Church of the Holy Trinity. Beautiful Gothic affair. Another sanctuary knocker. And the interior of the church. Really quite lovely. One of the things that impressed me about Stratford was the lack of commercialization. I was sort of bracing myself, since Shakespeare is so famous, to find a town just full of all sorts of gimcrackery and silly tourists, and it was not. It was very, very beautiful. I was impressed. This is the high altar. Some wonderful stained glass. And a memorial to Shakespeare himself. And he's buried there, and there's the famous lines, "Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear, to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be they who spares these stones, and cursed be he who moves my bones." The British have always thought that Shakespeare should be buried in the Poets' Corner of Westminster Abbey, but nobody has had the courage to dig him up and move him. So there it is, there's Shakespeare's grave. A nearby village called Shottery we went to, rather picturesque. And Anne Hathaway's cottage. I remember my mother used to have a picture of this. And of course that was Shakespeare's great love, Anne Hathaway. Part of the interior. Well, time to see another great house. This is Dyrham, D-Y-R-H-A-M-M, I think it is, sitting down in a valley. A gentleman by the name of Blathwayt developed a rather large fortune, was in various government positions. Eventually, I think he was Secretary of State under Queen Anne, or no, William III, and had amassed a fortune and built this rather handsome house. Now owned by the National Trust. The Blathwayt family owned it for hundreds of years, but they got out from under the burden of it and turned it over to the National Trust. My host, Colonel Lambert, had connections. We went there in a day in which it wasn't open, but he wanted me to see it, so we got in and had a very quiet private tour. Chapel on the grounds. A very impressive house. And this too was used in a movie. It was either Howard's End or Remains of the Day, but I remember watching the movie and seeing a car coming down that drive to the house. And as I watched it, I thought, I know this scene, and it was used as a movie set. A couple of very grand staircases, much of the original family furniture all put together. Quite cozy. I like this room. This was a state bedroom, I believe. Another grand staircase on the other side of the house. And that was in case the king ever visited, that elaborate bedstead. Charming house, charming. I was very impressed with Dyrham Abbey. And it is indeed a deer park, and the deer roam freely through the grounds of the place. This was very pleasant. Well, from there we went on to Bath, the city of Bath. And I always tell people, if you're going to Britain and you have limited time, you only see one or two places, go to Bath. It was one of those charming places I've seen. Dominated by its church, which is known as Bath Abbey. And there it is. Beautiful Gothic affair. Lovely tower, flying buttresses, wonderful Gothic work. And when you go inside, notice the roof, the ceiling. It's what is known as fan vaulting. Not the usual crisscross that you see in other Gothic cathedrals, but they actually look like fans, and it's called fan vaulting. This Bath Abbey is considered one of the three best examples of this in England, the other two being St. George's Chapel at Windsor, where the royal family are buried. And the one that I really loved best was in Cambridge, King's College Chapel, which is just breathtakingly beautiful. But this is Bath Abbey. Some more great stained glass. The town is lovely, and it's very well kept. Colonel Lambert's wife served on a flower committee. Apparently these towns have a competition as to who does the best flower arrangements. And one year Bath was considered the winner, and his wife had been on the committee, so they were very popular people for a year. Some charming old shops. And there you see young England, pink pants, looking for his cat. And here he's found it. It's a resort community, and that goes back to the days of the Romans. And one of the places is this famous pump room, P-U-M-P. People go there to drink the waters like they did at Saratoga or White Sulphur Springs. And this was a great place for lunch and meetings, and we had a wonderful lunch here. I adored the place. Orchestras playing. It was like being on the lounge of the Queen Mary, classic. It was just breathtakingly beautiful. I loved it. And this was an assembly room used for balls and other events at Bath. Now Bath goes back to the time of the Romans. And if you look at the old maps, the old plans, you see it was sort of a squared community. And it was very much a spa. I think it was called solus, a Latin word for health. And of course, over the years, these things all silted up, but later on they were rediscovered and dug out, and this is one of the Roman baths that has survived in Bath. I think that's me in the distance, I'm not sure. Another bath area. There's more than just the one Roman bath. And quite a handsome bridge called the Pulteney Bridge, which has sort of like the Ponte Vecchio in Florence. It's got shops and it's really quite impressive. The 18th century brought some beautiful buildings, and there is this row of houses, this one great grand row called the Crescent. And there's a better view of it. Beautifully done, classic, and of course today one of those houses would be worth a fortune, I'm sure. Okay. Okay. Now I'm changing families again. Marvelous how my hosts managed to connect with each other, and we would meet at some designated place and transfer me and my luggage and everything. Well, this is a village called Castlecombe, C-O-M-B-E, I believe. Considered one of the prettiest villages in England. And this is in the area that our friends in Callan visit when they go over there for their sister city troops. It was really quite charming. Castlecombe. So we changed hosts here. I had a wonderful lunch. And my next host started touring me. And we went to see this great house called Longleat. This is the ancestral home of the Marquis of Bath. Again, you're talking about late 1600s, early 1700s. Very classic with some Gothic detail, an enormous big house. As you can see, Downton Abbey I don't think is quite that large, but there it is. Jammed with furniture, paintings, statues, the collections of a wealthy family over generations. The Marquis of Bath was doing a great deal to promote this place, trying to bring as much tourism there as he could to keep it going. And I can't sniff at tourism because these places take a lot of money to run, as we're finding with our little houses here. These great houses usually had a great long hall or drawing room, tapestries, furniture. The state dining room, have a pleasant party there. And of course they had rooms set aside just to display costumes, gowns, china, whatnot. An impressive grand staircase. And from up looking down, and there's the Marquis himself. No, he didn't pose for me. That's a purchase slide, of course. But he was trying very hard. At one time, he created a zoo on the grounds and brought a bunch of lions. He thought that would attract tourists. Well, the British laugh at this sort of thing, and they had a cartoon showing the lions all sitting in the hall of Longleat, wrapped in blankets with their feet in tubs of hot water. They couldn't stand the cold of England. Longleat. Again, a cloudy day. This was somewhat disappointing, not because of the house or the collections, which are all very grand, but the way the tours were handled. Because of the heavy promotion, I was there on a weekday, not on a holiday, but there was a lot of people, and you were sort of ushered through a little too fast. You couldn't begin to take in what was there. It was a bit disappointing in terms of how the tours were handled. So that's Longleat. Leat, I'm told, was a medieval word for a stream, and a long stream. I'm not sure if that's historically accurate. Well, here's my next family I'm staying with in this area. Charming house that reminded me very much of the Wythe House in Williamsburg. My next host, Admiral Sir John Cuthbert, and his wife, Lady Cuthbert. He was very knowledgeable about architecture, and of course he took me to Longleat and to the other places. I enjoyed thoroughly being with these people. He had a wonderful record during the war as a British admiral, and he was knighted, so he was Sir John Cuthbert. The lady on the left was a friend of theirs, a Mrs. Galt, who I'm told was very friendly with the Eisenhowers during the war years, and she joined us for dinner. We had a beautiful dinner there. And again, they had dogs who followed me constantly, and the admiral would check me up if I was wake up in the morning and have the dogs bothered you? No, no. If you don't like dogs, you should never ever stay in a British house, country house. Well, there's the admiral under his portrait. He had quite a distinguished career. As it turned out, he was acquainted with the Macmillans, General Macmillan, who were the first family I stayed with in Scotland. And among other things, when Churchill made one of his trips to Roosevelt in the Second World War on the Queen Mary, he was on board with him as part of his staff. And when Elizabeth made a grand tour of the empire after her coronation, he had to take some supplies to Gibraltar, and then he was one of the escorts of bringing her back. Delightful gentleman in their garden, and his dogs. He was a warden and very involved with this little country church that he took me one day to see. Really quite charming. Well, also while I was with Admiral Cuthbert, we went to see this other great house called Wilton House. This one I loved. Wilton House, again, dates from the late 1600s, 1700s. It's the home seat of the Earls of Pembroke, the Herbert family. Like many of these houses, it was added to and remodeled at various times. But here, a totally different tour arrangement than at Longleat. You weren't hurried through. They didn't promote it as much. There weren't crowds of people. You could walk through at your leisure. There were guides in each room to guide you, answer questions. And I fell in love with this place. I thought it was just beautifully done. A few pictures. I think they're mostly horses and carriages. Well, the house has a long series of rooms. You might say an enfilade of rooms, and you go through one after another. All of them beautifully maintained, and again, full of beautiful furnishings, paintings, and so forth. So you pass from one room to another. Ante-rooms, sort of like getting ready for the next big one. That picture was hanging right there, and that's one of the earls, one of the earlier family. Some people think the kids wear hair long today, but another beautiful room. This was called the Colonnade Room, and I understand at one time it was a state bedroom. Well, what is famous in the house, there's two rooms in particular. One is called the Cube Room because it's an exact cube, 30 feet wide, 30 feet long, and 30 feet high. And that leads to the Double Cube Room, which is 60 feet long. And this is the most famous room in the house and one of the most famous rooms in Britain. Dominated by the large painting on the far wall, which was done by the Van Dyck, the artist, and depicts the Herbert family. It was originally in London and they moved it to Wilton. Nice family portrait. The Cube Room, or the Double Cube Room, has a Second World War history. This house was taken over by the British Army during the Second World War, and I'm told that much of the planning for the invasion of Normandy was done in those rooms. This was an upstairs hall, cloistered style, and on the grounds is this Palladian bridge, quite a unique, delightful architectural addition. Well, also while I was with the Admiral, we went to Salisbury. And the main thing, of course, I wanted to see was Salisbury Cathedral. I missed one of the most famous things in England, Stonehenge. We were running out of time, and I had to choose between it and the cathedral, which was much more interesting. Now, this isn't the biggest cathedral. There aren't too many famous people buried here, but it's considered one of the most beautiful. It's been painted by many artists, Constable and others. And also it has the tallest tower. That's something like 404 feet high, I was told. And again, when you go into these things, you just sort of stop and take your breath with the size of something like this, built, excuse me, in the Middle Ages. Salisbury. They pointed out to us, I don't think I have a slide of it, but when the tower was built, the weight of it, because it was so high, some of the stone columns actually started to bend. And they became concerned, so they added additional structural work and so forth and so on. So there's never been any problem with it collapsing. But they point out to you these stone piers that actually started to bend. That's the mechanism for the great clock and the cloister. There's a picture of rural England, the stream, the swans, the ducks, the cathedral. As I say, painted by many artists. I think Constables are the most famous. Well, Admiral Cuthbert then drove me north to meet the fifth host, and we went through some very pleasant country as we were moving north. Much of this could be Chester County, I think. The Admiral told me that this place used to be called Gibbet Hill because there was a gibbet there where they hung criminals. Let them hang on the hill. A beautiful, beautiful countryside and very appealing to me. This was another small town that we drove through, I understand, associated with Alfred the Great. Somehow cars seem out of place in this architecture. Well, the fifth of the families, that is the ones who were arranged for me, lived in this house. I think it was called Stonebridge. Charming home. And here's my host and hostess. And it was with these people that I toured Oxford University. He was a graduate of Oxford, and his wife had been, her father had been dean of one of the colleges, so they knew it very well. And I spent a great deal of pleasant hours here. They had a lovely home. That was her brother who was visiting at the time. And you know, this whole thing was much better than going to a hotel or on a tour. We would come back from a day touring with these people, and we would have tea in their home and then later dinner, and it was just like being with family, really. Well, with them, I toured Oxford, which I wanted so much to see. This is the main street, which they call the High. And with them, I just had a fabulous time touring this place. An ancient bridge and one of the towers. No, that's not Princeton or Yale. This is Oxford, which inspired those other places in America. Magdalen, or as they pronounce it, Magdalen, I think is the most beautiful tower in this whole collection of colleges. And the university is a collection of individual colleges, incidentally, which is how it's arranged. And I loved this tower and took several pictures of it. We had a sprinkling of rain. If you have a day in England without at least a little bit of rain, you haven't been there. This is still part of Magdalen. I think it was called the New Wing, built, no, I don't know, 1700, something like that. Again, a lot of greenery, a lot of gardens. I was fascinated as we meandered in and out of these with two very knowledgeable people. And the arches, the towers, the architecture, and of course the playing fields. The colleges were built at various times, some of them older than others, and some very new modern ones. No, I didn't take much pictures of the new modern ones, but the old ones fascinated me. Oops. Time to change. I think we'll take a minute and let you stand and stretch while we change this. You put the light on for a moment, please. Yeah. And we'll do 6 next. I'll get a drink of water. Huh? Stand and stretch for a minute.
Same for leading the exercise. A few jumping jacks.
I'm not doing something right here. I'm not in the travel business. For some reason that won't go in.
Did you go through an agency or somebody? How did you do it?
I'll tell you about it. Is that it?
You got all these hosts and hosts, he's taking them everywhere. You don't have to worry about renting a car and trying to figure out which way to go with your GPS. Right?
I'll tell you later. Well, we got 6, 7, and then we have 2 more.
Exactly, and there are roses everywhere.
Well, all that rain in England is great for gardens.
Our brief little visit in the British Isles was Ireland, and they called that a soft day. Oh, it's going to be a soft day again today. A soft day.
What's
that? It's raining a little bit. It's a soft day.
Okay, we're into 6. Okay, then we get these. Start boxing some of these up. 5, and then we'll go to. This is 8, and this is 9. Yeah, 4. That's 7, and that's 8, and that's 9. Okay. While you're standing, while we have a break, does it look like England, Tony?
Sure. As long as 18 years old. This one is a protected bird.
While we have a break, I'll try to answer a question. I've had a question is, how did I arrange staying with these families? How it came about, I had been to Britain a couple times before, mostly London, touring on my own, you know, go to Windsor or whatever. I'm out of camera range, he tells me. So I decided I wanted to go to Britain and tour the countryside. And I didn't know how to do it or how to arrange it. Well, from previous information gathering, I had made a friend with the British government travel office in New York City. Not a travel agency, but the government agents which distributed information on traveling. And the lady, June Keir, was delightful, and we got acquainted. So I went to see her. I said, how am I going to arrange this? She says, well, you could hire a car and go around. And of course, driving on the other side of the road, I figure I'd make a wrong turn and that'd be the end of the tour. Or you could take a train to here, to there, or take a guided tour. I don't want any of that. Oh, she says, I have just the thing that might work for you. Turned out there was a gentleman in London who had a country home, and he was accustomed to entertaining people. So we had the idea that there were probably a lot of people in the British Isles who had homes, who'd be happy to earn a little money entertaining people and so forth. So we started to put some trial ads in magazines like The Tatler and Country Life and so forth. Got a lot of responses. So we created a business he called Oakleaf Enterprises. And the deal was, these people would, of course, give them the information where they were and so forth. And if somebody went to Oakleaf, well, I'd like to see Gloucestershire or Warwickshire or wherever, he'd check and see if he had a family in that area that was available. So you went there, you had dinner. It was sort of like a bed and breakfast thing in a way. And you stayed overnight. Now, no money passed between you and the family. It was all arranged, paid with the Oakleaf people in London. So I thought, well, that'd be great, but how am I going to get from house to house? Well, then Miss Keir said, no, wait a minute. Some of these are doing a refinement of this. Some of these families are willing not just to do, overnight and bed and breakfast, but to do touring in their immediate area. I said, oh, that's perfect. So that's what I did. They found, I told him where I wanted to go, what I wanted to see, what part of Britain I wanted to go to. And the gentleman, whose name escapes me now, in the London office, would check and see if he had a family there. And if they were available, the dates that I was going to be in Britain. And that's when it was. I mean, it would be like you had a friend came, and they wanted to go to Longwood, they wanted to go to Hagley, they wanted to see the Amish country, and you hosted and you took them. So that's the way it was. And I traveled with these people. There were 4 families in Scotland and 5 in England. Now, Mr. Davy was a separate friend. And then there's one last one that there was another friend that you'll see at the end of it. But that's how it was done. And all these people were wonderful. There was none of them I couldn't stay longer with. We were in touch, for some years. So that's the answer to the question is,
How long was the trip?
a month. Britain, a month of Britain, oh yeah. Not enough. Not enough. All right, let's go. Second half. Intermission's over. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, we're going on with Oxford. Oxford was a major thing. And one of the buildings that impressed me most at Oxford University was this one. It's called the Bodleian Library. And it was donated by a wealthy man and it's a fantastic structure. And the front of it has this tower, which is called the Tower of the 5 Orders. You see the columns, they're all different, Doric to Ionic to Corinthian. This building absolutely fascinated me. The Bodleian Library, one of the greatest libraries in the world. Another favorite picture of mine, the architecture, the shadows, and a little bit of water on the paving. One of the ancient libraries. It's an enormous library. And like our Library of Congress, I think every book printed in Britain gets a copy that goes here to that. The tower taken through one of the arches. This is called the Radcliffe Camera. It's a rotunda building, and it's part of the library and is connected with it. And again, my passion for taking pictures through arches and so forth. The Sheldonian Theatre, used for various displays and programs. And I got up on the roof there. There was an area, and I could take these pictures overlooking the area. And that is the top of the tower of the Bodleian Library. Well, I was having just an endless field day, the days we were there, with my hosts meandering through all these colleges. There's Magdalen and Merton and Christ Church and Oriel, and I've forgotten all the names. Variety of architecture, not all of it medieval, not all of it Gothic, some of it's neoclassical. And a lot of it deteriorating. Some of it was built of stone, which wasn't all that great. And with air pollution, some of the stone was deteriorating, and I saw a couple of buildings where they had taken the whole facades down and they were redoing it. But the ancient buildings with the collection of age of grime, absolutely fascinating. You think of the generations of students who went through this. Now, this is Christ Church College. This is very often photographed with these arches and so forth. Now, a couple of other men who were fascinated meandering through this and through Cambridge were our 2 Philadelphia boys, Cope and Stewardson, who as young men traveled to Britain and studied all this and became architects. And they eventually formed their own firm, Cope and Stewardson, in Philadelphia. And early on got commissions for school buildings. And one of the earliest was in Bryn Mawr. And drawing on what this is called Tom Tower, by the way, drawing on what they saw, they used those ideas in schools at Bryn Mawr later at Penn, and most prominently at Princeton. And in so developed what became known as the American Collegiate Gothic style of architecture. Some people would say they copied, I would say they adapted it. Interesting to us because when Mr. Houston had Greystone Mansion designed by them, they were starting to work on this Collegiate Gothic style of architecture. And our building made the National Register because the National Park Service said it was definitely a step in the development of the style for which these people became so very famous. Wonderful ironwork in various places around the campus. I love the lawns. I mean, it's so beautifully done. Some very wonderful old carvings. I think I love Cambridge more. I didn't do Cambridge on this trip. I did it on a previous one. I have a lot of pictures of Cambridge, but they're black and white. I wasn't into slides then. Cambridge has a more country atmosphere, or at least it did then. The area around Oxford is pretty well built up, a lot of modern offices and so forth. How do you like that piece of ironwork? Isn't that gorgeous? And the detail of it. Ancient, ancient. They all jumble together very well, these various styles though. And again, one of my arch pictures. I think this is Oriel College, I've forgotten which. Great lawns. And another arch vista. Well, also in the area of Oxford is another one of England's most famous great houses, Blenheim Palace. And there you see it. Now this goes back to the Churchills. The first Duke of Marlborough, who defeated Louis XIV's armies in the continent in Blenheim in, I think it was 1704. And the grateful British nation under Queen Anne decided to reward him by giving him a great grand house. So we got one. This is Blenheim Palace, the seat of the Dukes. Now, I talked early with the show with Castle Howard and John Vanbrugh. Well, Vanbrugh was also the architect of this place. The Duke of Marlborough thought his work was great. And there was an agreement that this palace given by a grateful nation to the Duke of Marlborough should be very outstanding, large, and speak of war, victories, and British. I mean, just look at that place across the thing. The one person who didn't like it was the Duchess, Sarah Churchill. She didn't like Vanbrugh and she hated this place. She wanted something of a cozy country house. Well, you see what she got. But it is very grand and it was impressive. I'm sorry I have no interior slides. The gift shop for some reason wasn't open that day. But there it is. Now Vanbrugh did this massive great piling of stone. Oh, he had his critics, to be sure. When he died, one critic said, "Oh, lie heavy upon him, earth, for he did place heavy burdens on you." But this is the seat of the Churchills. And that's the grand courtyard as you came into the house. Vanbrugh designed it and Castle Howard, two of the most famous houses in England. And there it is. Well, we went to see this church, a little place called Blaydon. And the reason for going there, my host took me there because I wanted to see Winston Churchill's grave. And he is buried here. Now, as I understand, only the Dukes of Marlborough themselves were buried in the chapel in the palace. The rest of the Marlborough family were buried here in this church. But there's Churchill's tombstone. And this is Consuelo Vanderbilt Balsan. Now you're going to ask, what's a Vanderbilt doing here? Well, she became at one time the Duchess of Marlborough. In the Gilded Age of American history, the late 19th, 20th century, when enormous fortunes were made by American industrialists and manufacturing railroads, whatever, and after you had achieved all the appurtenances of wealth, like a grand townhouse on Fifth Avenue, a villa in Newport, box at the Metropolitan Opera, ocean-going yachts, private railroad cars, the next thing was to have a titled son-in-law. So there were a number of cases of American heiresses married off to European titles. Jay Gould's daughter married and became the Duchess of Talleyrand. But the most celebrated alliance of money and European titlement was this one. Consuelo Vanderbilt's father was W.K. Vanderbilt. She grew up in great wealth herself. And she was a great-granddaughter of the Commodore who founded the thing. And somehow they met, and she married and became the Duchess. It was a very happy arrangement. The Vanderbilts got a very prominent marriage, titled son-in-law. And the Marlboroughs got quite a large bundle of Vanderbilt railroad stock. And as I understand, Blenheim Palace got central heating. She later divorced him, and she married a Frenchman by the name of Balsam. But because she was the Duchess of Marlborough, she is indeed buried here. And from this point, it was pointed out through the trees, you can see Blenheim Palace in the distance. I love these small English country churchyards, and roses everywhere. Well, I left the last family, and they got me to the railroad station, this place called Charlbury, to get on the train to go to London. So at the end of this, you're going to see some of London. So this was leaving the country there, having a pleasant train ride through lovely countryside to get to London. Well, I got to London and checked in the hotel and got settled, but shortly thereafter got back on the train to Waterloo Station to go to this little place in the country called Virginia Water. British trains are fun. Now, Virginia Water is very close to Windsor, a great park, and it gets its name from Queen Elizabeth I, known as the Virgin Queen, just as our state of Virginia. So I was visiting with friends here, and while I was there, hiked around this park of Virginia Water. And one day we had a double rainbow. The other one's a little faint, but there it is. A totem pole brought over from Canada. And there it is. Now the connection here, this is a bit of family. One of my father's cousins married an English girl. They lived in Philadelphia. She was the only one of her family who ever settled in the States. So when I went to England for the first time in 1963, she wanted me to meet her family, particularly her niece, the lady in the blue dress, Pamela, or Pam. Her husband, Duncan, and their 2 children. So the first time I went there, I met them, the children were 13 and 11. I visited with them and stayed with them when I was there in '66, so of course I went to see with them again. Wonderful, and as I say, distant relatives through marriage, but I certainly enjoyed them and thought of them as family. The husband was a rather proper British type. He had been in the war, in British intelligence in the Second World War, and later had become, was working with British Ford Motor. His wife Pamela, during the war, became an automobile mechanic, doing her thing, and she was as capable, I think, as any mechanic. I was always comfortable with her in case the car broke down. Queen Elizabeth did the same thing as a princess. So there's the 2 children, Pam, the son, Nigel, and the daughter, Beverly. Duncan liked to amuse himself with British laughter. Here he is. The only way to be safe was 2 raincoats and 2 umbrellas in Britain. But Duncan was an absolute delight. And his daughter adored him, as you can see. They were wonderful. That's Beverly. We're getting ready for dinner, as you can see there. And I love the kids, and I just love being with these people. I mean, it was a personal family touch. Nigel enjoying brandy before dinner. And there he is opening the wine for dinner. A child after my own heart, no question about it. In fact, he later went in, when he was grown, many years later, went into the wine business in Prague, I think he lived, and he made a career of it. But he was interested in other things, although he wasn't looking at books, he was studying records. And for some time, when he was in his early 20s, he had quite a career as a disc jockey in some London clubs. This was Nigel. Time for change. Okay. Now, it so happened that I was there this weekend as Nigel, now 18, getting ready to go off to college. And big man of the world, didn't want his parents taking him. He was going alone. So I had come back to London the night after I was there for dinner, and I agreed I would send him off. So he came in that morning. I went down to Waterloo Station, picked him up, brought him to the hotel where I was staying, and had a grand lunch for him. And he was just an absolute delight, very poised. His father didn't like the long hair. In fact, his father said he was going to buy stock in a shampoo company. But that was the style at the time. This is mild. 2 years later, when I was back in England, Nigel had become rather maud. But there he is, an absolutely delightful kid. So I had a great luncheon for him, and he was completely upset by fussy waiters. I mean, he knew how to handle them and all, and I would give him the wine cards to choose. He and I agreed we were both pretty heavy snobs. We had a lot in common. He took this picture of me. Well, I got time to see him off. He was taking the train, and we went to St. Pancras Station, and here we are there, a bit windswept. So we had a wonderful time together, and I was so happy that I was just there as he was going off to college. Looking very serious, keeping up the stiff upper lip. But there he is as the train was pulling out. Well, thanks to the fact that Nigel was leaving from this station, I got to see the station, which is called St. Pancras. Now, anyone in the Philadelphia area old enough to remember Old Broad Street Station, this would give you heart murmurs. And being an aficionado of both railroads and Victoriana, I was fascinated. When it was built in the late Victorian era, it was a hotel. It was a great hotel at the head of the train block. And as Victorian went very, very, very out of style, there was a movement to just knock it all down. Well, first of all, it was too big to tear down, and by that time, there was a definite interest developing in preserving Victorian things. As you can see, great train shed, it was massive. So while the hotel closed, it continued to operate as a railroad station. Well, after I saw Nigel off, I'm meandering around, and I ran into this very friendly policeman. And I was asking, I said, well, what is this? What's happening? It was all closed up. Oh, he said, would you like a walk around, sir? I said, absolutely would. So he kindly gave me a tour of it. The grand staircases, the interior, fascinating, absolutely fascinating. The good news is it was not demolished, and it's been restored. I understand the hotel is functioning again. And it is now the London terminus of the Channel, the railroad service between London and Paris. Well, I'm going to give you some of London. Here's, of course, the Houses of Parliament. A grand vista from across the river. To the left, you see the White Towers of Westminster Abbey, the Victoria Tower, and, of course, Big Ben at the other end. Now, the other side of the river, this embankment has these wonderful lamps with, they look like fish carvings. In recent years, they put a huge Ferris wheel over here, which I have not seen. The photographs turned me off. The wrong place to put it. It looks like something from an amusement park, but there it is. There's the detail of these metal fish around these very ornate light stands, which I hope they haven't removed. And of course, one of the most famous buildings in Britain, Big Ben, the clock tower, designed by an architect named Pugin, who was famous for this sort of architecture. Looking down the river, this Scotland Yard is an area, and it's wonderful to walk along the embankment. The modern building with a sort of tower in the middle of the picture was called the Shell Mex building, which I think belonged to Shell Oil. And right to the right of it, the lower building, was the famous old Savoy Hotel. My first stay in London was there, and I was disappointed. It wasn't quite what I thought it would be. But there's Big Ben. Really an incredible building. It's quite a collection. Of course, the older Parliament buildings burned somewhere in the 19th century. The only thing that survived was Westminster Hall, which is the tower in the middle. But the rest of it was pretty well done. And Pugin and Barry, Sir John Barry, designed this present Houses of Parliament. Some dramatic skies. Now across the street was this place with this restaurant, St. Stephen's, which I ran into my first trip and found it was a wonderful place for dinner. And I understand it was also a place where members of Parliament would go to get a quick drink in between sessions of Parliament. And they had a bell system to ring them when they had to get back to the House of Commons. Well, this is Whitehall, and the white thing in the middle is called the cenotaph. And that does for London what our Arlington cemetery does. It's a memorial to the soldiers from the First World War and Second. And as with Arlington, foreign dignitaries will come there and lay a wreath. This is the entrance to 10 Downing Street, where the Prime Minister's office and home is. I am told you can't get this close now. Security since 9/11 is horrible. But when I was there, you could walk right up to it, and it was very, very easy. Number 10 Downing Street. Whitehall. This was a palace that never was quite finished. And it was from a window in there that King Charles I stepped out to the scaffold to be hung when he was executed at the Revolution. He made a great speech, and somebody said, nothing in his life behaved him better than the leaving of it. Well, one of the great tourist things in London, of course, is to see the horse guards with their wonderful mounts, who have to stand silent and put up with tourists who do everything they can to annoy them. And how they keep from kicking them is beyond me, but they're not supposed to. Trafalgar Square, a busy, bustling place. St. Martin in the Fields Church. And the Nelson Monument commemorating the Battle of Trafalgar. And in the background, the National Gallery of Art. Beautiful park in the center of London called St. James Park, and one area looking back towards the government buildings in Whitehall. And the other, you're looking towards Buckingham Palace. Lovely green. I understand those chairs are out there all the time. Nobody steals them. Don't think that would happen in New York, but there they are. Great Buckingham Palace. The Queen was not in residence. When she is, there's a flag on the pole. You always know when she's not there. When the Queen is in residence, there will be a flag. And since she wasn't there, I didn't bother to call. Some very nice gardens and flowers around it. And this is the Mall, which runs from just in front of Buckingham Palace down to the Admiralty Arch in the government area. And right in front of Buckingham Palace is this great monument to Queen Victoria, looking very grand. Victoria Regina Imperatrix, Queen Empress. Well, one of the great sights of London is to watch the changing of the guard at Buckingham Palace. This occurs, I believe, every day. The incoming guard marches up from the barracks on what's called Birdcage Walk with their band, and the tourists are all standing along the fence watching. What happens, they go into the enclosure behind the fence, and there's a great deal of shouting and stepping around as they make their maneuvers. The bands play usually theater music. I love the sound of British military band, and you hear them playing, you know, the Scipio and the Thin Red Line or Soldiers of the Queen. And then when it's over, the departing guard with their band comes out with a police escort. I found it amusing that the flower of the British Army needs police escort to get in and out of Buckingham Palace. But the traffic in this area is just horrendous, and of course they close it for the guard scene. You can see the crowd of people watching. The band coming out, but I was told, stand on the steps of the Victoria Monument, and you can get a great clear view, which exactly I did. Nobody in front of you, and just enjoyed this enormously. Every now somebody says, well, they'll do away with the monarchy in Britain. I say, no, no, no. It would kill the tourist business to do away with the monarchy. It does add a great deal of color. The band has passed, and here comes the troops. I had an experience, an amusing experience one day watching this. I was standing on the Victoria Monument, and the chap next to me was chatting with me, a young man, very, very knowledgeable and explaining to me everything that was happening and all the steps. So after it was over, I said, well, you certainly know a lot about this. He said, well, he said, I'm a guardsman. And he said, I've been through this many times, but I always wondered what it was look like. So he said, I had a day off, and I thought I'd pop down here and see what it looked like. So he was wonderful. Yeah. There you see the unicorn and the gates of Buckingham Palace. And there's beautiful gates. Now there's a park to that side called the Green Park, which leads from the palace grounds up to Piccadilly, lined with some great buildings. This one, especially interesting, is called Bridgewater House. And it was the townhouse of the Earl of Ellesmere. Now I showed you pictures of my family people in Virginia Water. Well, my dad's cousin's wife, as a young woman growing up in late Victorian, early Edwardian England, became a governess. And she eventually had a great job as governess to the daughter of the Earl of Ellesmere, and she lived in this place. And she had told me a great deal about it. And Lady Margaret, who was her charge, our lady, wasn't Margaret, I'll think of the name, they became great good friends, and she sort of leaned on Evelyn until Evelyn passed away. So Evelyn told me about living in this place, and when we saw that other TV show upstairs, downstairs, I was prepared for all the nuances that were in this. And this is the street entrance to Bridgewater. And those of you who are continuing to watch Downton Abbey, the very last sequence of the 4th series, Lady Mary is saying goodbye to one of her suitors on the steps. They use this as the Lord Grantham's London townhouse. So that's Bridgewater House. The Bridgewaters had an enormous, enormous country home. Evelyn gave me pictures. Unfortunately, it's gone. And it was like Downton Abbey. Picture people coming and going like a hotel. The Earl of Ellesmere, I'm told, had a very handsome collection of art, and he had a whole wing full of paintings. At the time of the Second World War, for safety, he had them taken down, moved to the country somewhere, which was a good thing because this place had a direct hit during the Blitz, and the art gallery was completely destroyed. Well, this is St. James Street leading towards St. James Palace, another old residence. Sometimes the Prince of Wales has lived in this place. And yes, it has its own guards and ceremonies. A lot of shops, and this was the most curious one, called Lock & Company. I don't know that they're still in existence. I've heard that they're not. But Lock & Company was a manufacturer of hats. It was a hat store. And if you went to Lock & Company, they had this device that they put on your head. They sort of cooked your hat. They fit it in great detail, the size of your skull. And they recorded it all. It was almost like a computer design. I got a few hats from them for fun. So if you got shuffled off to Malaysia or India or wherever and you needed a hat, you sent them a note and they had your measurements and they'd get it for you. Wonderful. Fortnum & Mason, department store in London, quite a famous place. And this is Piccadilly Square. It's sort of like Times Square, all these gaudy things. And in the middle of this monument with Eros with his arrow. Now this was developed by a nobleman named Lord Shaftesbury. So the British, who loved punning, said, well, it was appropriate because the god there is going to bury his arrow, his shaft, into the ground. Lord Shaftesbury. British have a strange sense of humor sometimes. But that's Piccadilly. Some wonderful buildings that weren't all destroyed. I do agree with Prince Charles, who's an architectural critic, that some of the modern developments did more damage to London than the German Blitz. Okay. Oh, bravo. We'll pick them up later. Let it go. They all have to be sorted back into files, so we'll get it. The top came off. Nope. I'll get them later. Huh? Oh, I see it. Nope, not working out. Huh? There we are. We'll get them later. Well, this was the hotel I stayed in London on this trip, the Connaught. Very old-fashioned. It was sort of like a country house. It took me 3 trips to London to find a hotel I really liked. The first one was the Savoy, which was an enormous disappointment. The second one was very modern, too American. But this was a charming place, and this, of course, is where I had Nigel. And when I came back to London a couple of years later, I stayed there again, the old Connaught. Well, one of the loveliest parts of London is this park area. And it's famous for people being allowed to talk, to give a speech on whatever they want, Hyde Park. And whether you're a serious politician or whether you're a candidate for the Nut House, you can say anything you want and you can talk. It's really, really impressive. And there's one of the less dignified speakers. But they attract a crowd. People come to, see this. And it was fun to watch them. I forget what they call the corner, but the park itself is quite huge, a lot of green space, and quite beautiful. It does for London what Central Park does for New York, a space of green in the middle of a big city, except that it's not surrounded with skyscrapers. Maybe it is now. It's been so long since I've been over there. There is this lake they call the Serpentine, which is really quite a beautiful spot. And I enjoyed Sunday afternoon hiking around here. Well, much as I love it, what's wrong? Did I miss something?
You dropped your mic.
Oh, is it okay? I granted some beautiful gardens. This great arch, and just beyond it is Apsley House, which is now open as a museum. It was the London townhouse of the Duke of Wellington. Tidy little townhouse. Well, eventually it was time to come home. And last look at Big Ben, last trip across Westminster Bridge, and on to Waterloo Station. Huge Victorian affair. And of course I used this more than any other station because when I went out to visit the family at Virginia Water, this was the connecting station. Piles and piles of luggage. And it was here to catch the ship to come home. Now in the days of a lot of passenger liners, since you didn't dock in London, they ran what they called the boat trains, which ran between London and Southampton. And so here I am getting on the boat train to go down. Very pleasant ride, about 2 hours through the Hampshire countryside. And the boat train. And there we are, Waterloo Station, getting ready to depart for Southampton. Last look at London as we pulled away. Well, when you get down to Southampton, the train comes right to the pier. And you can see the Queen Elizabeth there. And the train would pull into a station right next to it. When you were arriving, the same thing, you'd get off the ship and they would do customs and immigration officials, and then you get on the train and go up to London. So there's pulling into the station. And there's my boat home, the great Queen Elizabeth. This was Cunard's pride and joy, the Queen Mary, the Queen Elizabeth, the great pair. Two of the most famous ships in the history of transatlantic. And getting towards the end of her days, Cunard retired the Queen Mary in '67, and they were retiring this one in '68. I got there early, I got off the train, got to the thing, dumped the luggage, checked in, and then we had time and I walked around the piers. I wanted to have a last look, thinking this might be the last time I ever see the Elizabeth in port. Turned out it was, except for New York. You can see the huge size of this. The Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth were, well, both planned in the 30s. The Mary came out in 36. This one was launched in 38, but went into war service and didn't go into passenger service until after the Second World War. But there she is, the Queen Elizabeth. Rule Britannia. And they had these great cranes that moved along tracks alongside to load things on ships. One of my favorite pictures of the ship with the Cunard house flag with a lion on it, fluttering. All right, I'm on the ship. We're getting ready to go. That hotel in the distance was there since the early 1900s. When the Queen Elizabeth was launched in the fitting out yards at John Brown's in Scotland, the war came on. And they were anxious to get it out of the way to do war work. So Churchill said, okay, finish it so that she would run. But she was not fitted out as a luxury liner. So she made her trip out down the Clyde River, and they knew the Germans were waiting for it. And Germans figured they'd send it to Southampton to the dry dock. But no, they got secret orders and she went to the United States. Her maiden voyage was made under cover of great secrecy from the Clyde to New York. No one knew about it but Cunard's top officials. And they even billeted employees in the hotels here to fool the German spies. But she made it to New York. Thank God her machinery didn't break down, because it happened on maiden voyage. And first thing you know, here's this mammoth liner off the Long Island coast. This was the ocean terminal, which I understand is now gone. We were getting ready to sail. I've always found a very dramatic moment when you get on a ship, the tugs get ready to pull it out, and they start to move it away from the piers. And you're a few feet, a few yards, and then suddenly you realize you're not on land anymore. You're at sea. I never had that excitement on flying, but on ships, yes. This, incidentally, is the very same pier from which the Titanic sailed. It was the great ocean terminal for all the liners for many years. And when the major companies started to move their ships from Liverpool to Southampton, this is where they sailed from. And it was right there at that corner that the Titanic had her near accident, when another ship broke its moorings and started back towards it. And people think that was, oh Lord, what a superstitious thing, but you know, we ought to get off right now. So anyway, we pulled out, and of course they had to turn the ship around, and we headed down the Solent to the open area. Headed to France. That's the Isle of Wight, which is right where the Solent comes down to the channel. The ship in the distance, I was told, was the United States, the one that's sitting in Philadelphia waiting for whatever. She was too far away to get a good look, but she was also coming out from Southampton. Well, towards late afternoon, we were nearing the coast of France, and the sun was going down, and I had loved these pictures. We're coming into Cherbourg, and I leaned over the side to get this picture of the pilot boat. The ships would always have a pilot to bring them in. One of my favorite pictures, the sun right on the little sailboat. Calendar picture, huh? Okay, there we are. Now Cherbourg is very much open to the sea, and there are these enormous breakwaters, stone breakwaters, to protect the harbor, which we're just passing, as you see, and coming in. Occupying Cherbourg was a major objective of the Allied armies after our invasion of Normandy, because we needed a big port to unload the continuing line of ships with supplies. And the Germans did everything to keep us from getting to Cherbourg, and they did their best to make it unusable. They blew up docks and ships and so forth. Well, we left Cherbourg at night. The next morning, we were approaching the coast of Ireland. And as you can see, the city is getting a bit up, the pilot boat. Now, we didn't come to a pier. We went to Cobb, which used to be called Queenstown, and we anchored out in the harbor. And people who were boarding came on these tenders. And millions of people came to America from Ireland during the immigration period, and most of them sure came out on tenders. This was interesting. I was leaning over the side of the rail, look at all those steamer trunks, and watching this. And they put a gangplank out, all these people. Of course, these are not immigrants too much, they're mostly travelers, but in the old days there was a great deal of this, and I'm leaning over the side of the rail, and I've read so much about these things. This, incidentally, was the Titanic's last call, too, at Queenstown, or Cobb as it's now called. One last reel. Thank you. And of course, we were there for, I think, 4 hours. The tender came out and then went back, or a second tender, I've forgotten. And people came out on the tender and they were selling Irish lace and scarves and all sorts of souvenirs, and then they went back. But there you can see the stewards carrying the passengers' luggage on board up to the side. And sometimes, if the sea is rough, you can be pretty sick on that thing before you get on the main ship, bobbing up and down. Well, it was foggy. I was terribly disappointed here. I was hoping to see something of the Irish coast. And there's a great cathedral, the Cathedral of St. Colman there in Cobb. I couldn't see it. And for all I saw, we could have been off the coast of Zanzibar. The ship was called the Killarney. Another thing, as a student of shipping, not too far away is the old head of Kinsale. And it was in that area that the Lusitania was torpedoed in 1915. I saw nothing. It was this heavy fog. So there goes the pilot boat back. That's the only bit of Ireland I ever saw. And we're headed away in pretty heavy fog. The Gaunt lightship, not far from the harbor. Oh, there's a picture that the Cunard people took of our dinner table. Yes. Eating is a major part of these trips. The Elizabeth had this enormous dining room that was the whole width of the ship. At a party, that was Commodore Thrippleton Marr, who was captain and commodore of the Cunard line, and they called it farewell voyages. There were only 2 more round trips of the Elizabeth after this one, and then she was being retired. Well, we had the next day after we left Ireland, the sea was pretty decent. And clearing up, but a little rough. You can see we're a little at an angle. And I love to spend time on deck, which I did. We had a pretty good day the day after we left Ireland. Sea kicking up. I love this cloud picture, this one stretch of blue. A great mountain of clouds there. But the sea was beautiful this first day after we left Ireland. Then some clouds started to come in. I love this picture too, with just the bit of light on the Black Sea. What's coming? Gone into a storm. Getting hazy again. Queen Elizabeth, Liverpool. That was Cunard's headquarters. So they ships, although they weren't using Liverpool, were still designated. We're starting to roll a bit there, as you can see. Well, I firmly believe in that line in Gilbert and Sullivan's famous operetta, HMS Pinafore, when the Lord of the Admiral talks about how wonderful it is to be at sea, but he says, when the breezes blow, I generally go below and seek the conclusion of the cabin grants. So here I am when the weather got rough. And we had a couple of bad days, heavy fog, and one night we had one terrific storm, most of which I slept through, fortunately. My first crossing to Europe was made on the Queen Elizabeth in '63, and she was one of the most solid. You know, these things were built not for cruising just in warm water. They were meant for year-round crossing, and they were very solid. This was my cabin, very comfortable. And since I knew this would be the last time ever on the QE, I asked if they would give me the same cabin I had for my crossing in '63, and they did. And there we are. Telephone. And it had a little note on it that you can call anywhere in the world whilst at sea. Well, we had a bad day, as you can see. We had a real rough day one day with the sea, and I'm not doing too well. However, I did cheer up, and thinking about dinner ahead, I was able to make the change from t-shirt to tuxedo, which of course was how we dressed for these things. I was at the ship's doctor's table, and he was a delightful gentleman, old timer, knew all the traditions. And you didn't have to do anything. The stewards, who sort of folded into the woodwork, would have your dinner suit ready, your pajamas. I mean, everything was done. And as I say, they were floating Downton Abbeys. And of course, unlike the United States lines, where passengers didn't have that sort of thing, but the Cunard did it. For laughs, we had to get a picture taken in front of the life preserver, you know. Never forget the Titanic. And when I come back from dinner, as you see, the bed's made down, the slippers are out, your bathrobe is out. It was beautiful what they did. It was just great. Oh, it was. Floating Downton Abbeys. Well, the last day out was absolutely gorgeous. We had this marvelous day, calm seas, blue seas, clear weather, not a cloud, just a beautiful, beautiful last day at sea. Cunard's red stack. The deck's dry. Spent a lot of time on deck, watching the sea, which now looks beautiful. And everybody's out on deck, enjoying this wonderful day. And it was the last day. We were due in New York the next morning. The deck stewards had all the chairs out and people out enjoying the sun. Queen Elizabeth. I took that out my cabin window, looking straight down at the rivets to the sea. Well, that day, as the evening went on, the sun was going down, and this was quite memorable. I stood on the deck for the longest time, watching the sun slowly set in the western sky. And it was sort of sad, because this was the end of the voyage, it was the last day, and the great Queen Elizabeth was ending the near end of her time on the sea. It was nostalgic. Dinner the evening before, I had all sorts of sentimental music, and in fact, I saved the menu. I think it was the fourth day out on this, was the 30th anniversary of the launching of the QE in 1938. So we had a gala dinner that night, and it was really beautiful. So I stood there for the longest time, watching the sun slowly go down over the horizon. There's something fascinating about the sea, which got to me from the very first crossing. Slowly going down, almost gone. A bit of light as it gets further down, almost. And there we are. Gone. Time to get dressed for dinner and have one great last dinner. Dr. Hardy was a delightful gentleman. He had a cocktail party in his stateroom before this dinner. And he was passing chips and hors d'oeuvres, and I dropped some chips and I managed to catch him. He says, "Oh, you should play cricket for England. Good catch." Anyway, well, next morning, here we are in New York. End of the trip, a Pennsylvania Railroad tugboat, Al, and the Cunard flag and the British flag at the pier. Docked, the skyline of New York, and the ship. End of the voyage, and end of my talk. I hope I haven't put you all asleep. One of the amusing little thing coming back, I got this right, Sam? I stayed in New York for a day or two. I went to, after we got back, I think the next day I went down to the British travel office to meet my friend Miss Keir, who wanted to know all about, I found out I became a guinea pig for this project of those people doing touring, not just staying. So I went to see her and I had lunch with her and so forth. It was really very, very good fun. Well, then I came home on the train on my beloved Broadway Limited, which was coming to its close too. The Pennsylvania Railroad had merged with its great rival, the New York Central. And I'm on the train, and when I was a young man, I used to go to New York frequently, and I got acquainted with a waiter, a wonderful gentleman, Mr. Hemingway, his name was, who was one of the waiters in the Broadway's dining room. And he happened to be on board that night I'm coming home. So I'm having a drink, and I noticed to my dismay that the mints were in wrappers that said New York Central Railroad, and the stir for the drink said New York Central. I said, "What is this?" Well, he said, "You know, we're sorting out stuff in the dining car division," but he said, "I'll tell you, there ain't no New York Central Silver on the Broadway." No New York Central Silverway. So that was the finale of the trip, and I was happy my parents were waiting for me at the Paoli station. So that was this trip. If you've had any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. If I haven't put you all to sleep by this time.
Great trip. It was wonderful.
I'm glad I did it when I was there. Of course, I'm getting too old to travel now, and I hate airplanes with a passion, so here I am. Well, thank you all for coming. My pleasure to have you.
Thanks.